The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows as Harold stood at the counter, carefully arranging flowers in a crystal vase. His hands weren't as steady as they used to be, but he wanted everything perfect for today. 60 years, 6 decades of marriage. Sometimes he couldn't believe it himself. "You're going to drop that vase if you keep fussing with it," Margaret called from the doorway, a gentle smile playing on her lips. Even at 80, she still had that same twinkle in her eye that had caught his attention all those years ago at the church social. "Just making sure it's nice for our guests," Harold replied, stepping back to admire his work. Not every day a couple celebrates 60 years together. Margaret walked over and squeezed his hand. For just a moment, Harold noticed something flicker across her face. A shadow maybe, or worry. But before he could ask, she was smiling again, already moving to check on the food warming in the oven. The house had been buzzing with activity since dawn. Their daughter Patricia had arrived early with her husband, bringing trays of sandwiches and a cake so large it barely fit in the refrigerator. Their son Robert came next, hauling folding chairs from his truck, complaining good-naturedly about his back. Soon the grandchildren arrived, and then the great-grandchildren, filling the modest Connecticut home with laughter and noise. Harold loved days like this. The chaos, the voices overlapping, the way his great-grandson Tommy kept trying to sneak frosting from the cake when he thought no one was watching. This was what life was about: family, love, permanence. "Grandpa, tell us how you met Grandma again," called out his granddaughter Lisa, settling onto the couch with her own daughter on her lap. Harold chuckled. He'd told this story 100 times, but he never tired of it. "Well, it was 1964. I was 22, fresh out of college and completely clueless about women." "That much hasn't changed," Margaret teased from across the room, earning laughs from everyone. "I went to this church social because my mother practically dragged me there. I was standing by the punch bowl, probably looking as uncomfortable as I felt when I saw her." Harold's eyes found Margaret's across the crowded living room. She was wearing a blue dress and she was talking to Mrs. Henderson about gardening. Something about the way she spoke, so careful and thoughtful, it just drew me in. "He spilled punch all over himself trying to get my attention," Margaret added, and the room erupted in laughter again. "I did not spill it. I strategically placed it on my shirt to break the ice," Harold protested, grinning. What he didn't mention, what he'd always thought was just nervousness, was the way Margaret had seemed almost startled when he first approached her. How she'd glanced toward the door as if calculating an escape route. How it took her a moment too long to smile. He'd chalked it up to shyness back then. Now it was just part of their story. The afternoon rolled on with more family arriving. Old friends from the neighborhood stopped by. The Hendersons brought a casserole. The Thompsons from 2 streets over brought wine. Father Michael from their church came with a blessing and stayed for cake. The little house felt like it might burst at the seams. Harold stood in the corner for a moment just watching. This was his life's work right here, not the career in accounting he'd retired from 15 years ago. Not the house or the car or any material thing. This family, this love, this connection spanning 3 generations. It made every struggle, every difficult year, every moment of doubt worth it. Margaret was across the room holding their newest great-grandchild, a 3-month-old named Sophie. She was cooing at the baby, her face soft with affection. Harold felt his chest tighten with emotion. How had he gotten so lucky? "She's something special, your Margaret," said Bill Henderson, appearing at Harold's elbow with a glass of wine. Bill and his wife had known them since they'd moved to this neighborhood in 1968. 60 years. That's rare these days. "I know it," Harold said quietly. "Sometimes I wonder what she ever saw in me." "Oh, stop that," Bill laughed. "You're a good man, Harold." "Always have been." She saw that. But Harold had always felt like he'd won the lottery with Margaret. She was smart, sharp as a tack even now. She spoke several languages, though she rarely did. She had this way of seeing right through people, understanding them in a way that sometimes unnerved folks, and she had depths he'd never quite reached even after 60 years. He'd asked her once, maybe 20 years into their marriage, if she ever felt like he truly knew her. She'd gotten this look on her face, sad and distant, and said, "You know the parts of me that matter, Harold. That's enough." At the time, he'd thought she was being poetic. Now he just figured everyone had their private thoughts. As the party continued, Harold noticed Margaret checking her watch more than usual. She kept glancing toward the stairs, toward their bedroom on the second floor. Once he caught her staring out the window with an expression he couldn't quite read. When she noticed him watching, she smiled quickly and returned to her conversations. "You all right, Maggie?" he asked during a quiet moment, using the nickname only he was allowed to use. "Of course," she said, but her voice was tight. "Just a bit tired. It's a lot of excitement. We can start wrapping things up if you want." No, I'm fine, really." She touched his cheek, a gesture so tender it made his throat catch. "Thank you for this." "For all of it. For 60 beautiful years." There was something in the way she said it, something that felt less like gratitude and more like goodbye. But before Harold could pursue the thought, their son Robert was calling everyone together for toasts. The speeches were lovely and embarrassing in equal measure. Patricia cried while talking about how her parents had shown her what real love looked like. Robert told a funny story about the time Harold tried to teach him to drive and they ended up in a ditch. The grandchildren shared memories. Even little Tommy, coached by his mother, said, "Great-grandma and great-grandpa are the best." Then Father Michael stood and raised his glass. "I've known Harold and Margaret for 40 years now. I've seen them through good times and challenging ones. I've watched them weather every storm with grace and commitment. What strikes me most about this couple is how they've built a life of such profound ordinariness. And I mean that in the best possible way." He smiled at them both. In a world that often celebrates the flashy and the dramatic, Harold and Margaret have shown us the beauty of the everyday, of choosing each other, day after day, year after year, of building something steady and true. That's the real miracle. Harold felt Margaret's hand tighten in his. When he glanced over, he saw tears streaming down her face. "Hey," he whispered. "You okay?" She nodded, wiping her eyes. "Just moved by it all, by how blessed we've been." But Harold noticed her other hand was trembling. He squeezed it gently, concerned now. As the sun began to set and guests started to leave, Margaret excused herself. "I'm just going to lie down for a bit. The excitement has caught up with me." Harold watched her climb the stairs, noting how she seemed to move with effort, like each step required conscious thought. He made a mental note to call the doctor next week. Maybe her blood pressure medication needed adjusting. Patricia came over, following his gaze. "Mom seems off today. Have you noticed? A bit. Probably just tired. It's been a big day." "Maybe," Patricia said, but she didn't sound convinced. "Dad, I found her crying in the kitchen earlier. When I asked what was wrong, she just hugged me and said she loved me." "It felt strange," Harold frowned. "I'll check on her in a bit. Let her rest first." After the last guest departed and the house was finally quiet, Harold tackled the cleanup. His children tried to help, but he shooed them away. "You've all done enough. Go home to your own families. I can handle a few dishes." It was nearly 9 o'clock when he finally finished. The house looked like their house again, tidy and peaceful. He made 2 cups of tea, Margaret's favorite chamomile blend, and headed upstairs. The bedroom door was slightly ajar. Harold pushed it open carefully, not wanting to wake Margaret if she'd fallen asleep. But she was sitting up in bed holding a small wooden box he'd never seen before. Her reading glasses were perched on her nose as she stared at something in her hands. "Maggie, I brought you some tea." She startled so badly she nearly dropped the box. For just a second, her face showed pure panic. Then she recovered, closing the box quickly and setting it on her nightstand. "Thank you, dear. That's very thoughtful." Harold set the tea down and sat on the edge of the bed. "What's in the box?" "I don't think I've seen that before." "Oh, just some old photographs," Margaret said quickly. Too quickly. "I was feeling nostalgic after today. Wanted to look at some pictures from when we were young." "Can I see?" "Not tonight. I'm too tired. Maybe another time." She reached for the tea, but her hands were shaking so badly that Harold had to steady the cup for her. "Margaret, you're worrying me. What's going on?" "Nothing. I promise. Just an emotional day." She sipped the tea, avoiding his eyes. 60 years is a long time, Harold. It makes a person think about things. About the past. About choices made and roads not taken. "Are you having regrets?" The question came out more vulnerable than he intended. "No." She grabbed his hand. "Never. Not about you, not about this life. You have to believe that. Then what is it?" Margaret looked at him for a long moment, and Harold saw something in her eyes he'd never quite seen before. It looked almost like fear, or maybe guilt, but then she blinked and it was gone. "I'm just an old woman getting sentimental. That's all. Now let's get some sleep. I'm exhausted." Harold wanted to push, wanted to understand what was troubling his wife, but 60 years of marriage had taught him when to press and when to give space. He kissed her forehead, turned off the light, and settled in beside her. In the darkness, he could hear her breathing, quick and shallow. Not the rhythm of sleep, but of someone thinking too hard. He reached over and found her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Whatever it is," he whispered, "we'll face it together, just like always." Margaret squeezed his hand but said nothing. What Harold didn't know, couldn't know, was that earlier that morning, before the party, before the guests arrived, Margaret had received a letter that changed everything, a letter that made her realize that after 60 years of silence, after 6 decades of carefully constructed normalcy, her past was finally catching up with her, and the wooden box on her nightstand, the one she'd hidden from him all these years, contained secrets that would shake the very foundation of everything Harold thought he knew about his wife and their life together. But tonight, they just held hands in the dark like they had for 60 years. Tomorrow would bring its own truths. Tonight was for holding on to the last moments of the life they'd built together, before everything changed. 2 weeks after the anniversary party, Harold woke up to find Margaret's side of the bed empty. It was just after 6 in the morning, earlier than she usually rose. He figured she'd gone down to make coffee, but something made him get up and check. He found her in the hallway, leaning heavily against the wall. Her face was pale, and when she tried to speak, her words came out slurred and wrong. "Maggie!" Harold rushed to her side, his heart hammering in his chest. "What's happening?" "Talk to me!" She tried to answer, but couldn't form the words. Her left arm hung limp at her side. Harold had seen enough medical shows to recognize what he was looking at. He grabbed the phone and called 911 with shaking hands. The ambulance ride to the hospital was the longest 20 minutes of Harold's life. He held Margaret's hand while the paramedics worked on her, taking her blood pressure, asking her questions she couldn't answer. Her eyes found his, wide with fear, and he tried to look calm even though he felt like his world was crumbling. At the hospital, doctors whisked her away for tests and scans. Harold sat in the waiting room, alone with his thoughts and his terror. He called their children. Patricia arrived first, her face streaked with tears. Robert came 30 minutes later, still in his work clothes from the night shift. "Is she going to be okay?" Patricia asked, gripping her father's hand. "They think it's a mild stroke," Harold said, his voice hollow. "The doctor said if we'd gotten her here any later, it could have been much worse." The hours crawled by. More family arrived. Friends from church came and sat with them. Father Michael stopped by and prayed with Harold, though Harold barely heard the words. All he could think about was Margaret, lying somewhere in this hospital, fighting for her life. Finally, a doctor came out. She was young, probably in her 40s, with kind eyes that had seen too much suffering. "Your wife is stable," she said, and Harold felt his knees go weak with relief. It was indeed a stroke, but a relatively minor one. "We've started her on medication to prevent another one. She'll need physical therapy, especially for her left side. But with time and work, she should recover most of her function." "Can I see her?" Harold asked. "Soon, she's sleeping now. The best thing for her is rest. Why don't you go home, get some things for her, and come back in a few hours? We'll take good care of her, I promise." Harold didn't want to leave, but Patricia convinced him. "Dad, you've been here for 8 hours. You need to eat something. Get Mom's things from home. We'll stay here and call you the second she wakes up." The house felt empty and wrong when Harold walked through the door. Too quiet, too still. He made himself a sandwich he didn't taste and tried to think about what Margaret would need at the hospital. Her reading glasses, definitely. Her favorite cardigan, the blue one, some comfortable slippers. He climbed the stairs slowly, feeling every one of his 82 years. In their bedroom, he gathered her things, packing them carefully in an overnight bag. He found her reading glasses on her nightstand, right next to that wooden box from the night of their anniversary. Harold picked up the box, running his fingers over the smooth wood. Margaret had never explained what was inside. She'd said old photographs, but something about her reaction that night had bothered him. The fear in her eyes, the way her hands shook. He set the box down and pulled open the drawer where she kept her sweaters, looking for that blue cardigan she loved. Not there. He checked the closet, then remembered she sometimes kept it in her nightstand for easy access when reading in bed. Harold reached for the bottom drawer of her nightstand, the one he'd never once opened in 60 years of marriage. It was locked, as it always was. Margaret had told him years ago that it contained jewelry from her mother, pieces too valuable to just leave lying around. He'd never questioned it, never felt the need to. But now he needed her insurance card, her medication list, things that might be in that drawer. He looked at her keychain, sitting in the little dish where she always left it. There was a small silver key he'd seen 1,000 times but never really noticed. Harold hesitated. In 60 years, he'd never violated Margaret's privacy. Never read her diary when she kept one. Never opened her mail or gone through her purses. Trust was the foundation of their marriage, but she was in the hospital. He needed her insurance information. This was practical, not snooping. He picked up the key and slid it into the lock. It turned smoothly, and the drawer opened. There was no jewelry inside. Harold stared at the contents, his mind struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. Documents, lots of them. Photographs of Margaret when she was young, but not photos he recognized. She was with people he'd never seen before, standing in front of buildings that didn't look American. He picked up a passport, but the cover was wrong. It wasn't the blue American passport he was familiar with. This one was old, worn, and when he opened it, the name inside made his blood run cold. Margaret Kovacs. The photo was definitely Margaret, but younger, maybe 19 or 20. The birth date was listed as 1943, not 1945 like she'd always told him, and the birthplace, Budapest, Hungary. Harold's hands started to shake. He set the passport down and picked up another document. This one was in German, official-looking with stamps and seals. Then another in Hungarian, papers with Margaret's photo but different names. Different dates, different places. His wife, his Margaret, the woman he'd been married to for 60 years, had multiple identities. Harold sat down hard on the bed, still holding the documents. This had to be some mistake. Maybe these belonged to someone else. Maybe Margaret was holding them for a friend or relative. But no, that was her face in every photo. Younger, but unmistakably her. He kept digging through the drawer, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. There were letters, dozens of them, in languages he couldn't read. Some appeared to be official correspondence. Others looked personal, written in careful script on thin paper that had yellowed with age. Then he found the file folder. It was thick, manila-colored, with stamps across the front that read, "Classified" in faded red ink. The dates on the stamps were from 1963 and 1964. Harold opened it with trembling fingers. Inside were reports, forms, documents that looked governmental. He saw words like operative and extraction and relocation. There were photographs of Margaret, surveillance-style photos taken from a distance. She was in cities he didn't recognize, meeting with people whose faces had been blacked out. One document, typed on official letterhead, made his breath catch. It was dated March 1963 and titled, "Subject Margaret Kovacs, Asset Reassignment and Identity Creation." Harold read slowly, having to reread several passages because his brain refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. The document described Margaret as a valuable asset who had been compromised during operations in East Berlin. It detailed how she'd witnessed something classified, something that put her life in danger. The solution was to give her a new identity and relocate her to the United States. Subject will be given the identity of Margaret Anderson, born 1945 in Boston, Massachusetts. All records have been created to support this background. Subject is to maintain deep cover indefinitely. No contact with former associates or family. Regular check-ins with handler to cease after 5 years if subject remains uncompromised. Harold felt like he was drowning. The woman he married, the woman he'd built a life with, raised children with, grown old with, didn't exist. Margaret Anderson was a fiction, a cover story, a lie created by some government agency to hide whoever his wife really was. He kept reading, finding more pieces of the puzzle. Margaret, or Margaret, had been recruited young, maybe 16 or 17. She'd worked as a courier during the height of the Cold War, moving information between Eastern and Western Europe. In 1962, something went wrong on a mission in East Berlin. The file didn't say exactly what, but several passages were redacted, blacked out with heavy marker. Whatever she'd seen or learned, it was enough to get her killed, so they'd erased her old life and given her a new one. Harold found a photograph at the bottom of the folder. It showed Margaret, young and scared-looking, standing with a stern-faced man in a suit. On the back, someone had written, "Last photo as MK, March 1963. He flipped through more pictures and found another one labeled "First photo as MA, April 1963. Orientation complete." In this second photo, Margaret looked different. Her hair was styled differently. She wore American clothes, but her eyes looked hollow, like something inside her had died. Harold realized with a sinking feeling that this photo was taken only about a year before he met her at that church social. She'd been Margaret Anderson for barely a year when they'd started dating. He'd met her when she was still learning how to be someone else. Every memory of their courtship suddenly felt different. The way she'd been hesitant to talk about her childhood. How she'd said her parents were dead, killed in a car accident. That was a lie. Had her real parents died in the war? Were they still alive somewhere in Hungary? Did they even know what happened to their daughter? He remembered how nervous she'd seemed when he proposed, how she'd cried and asked him if he was sure, really sure he wanted to marry her. He'd thought she was just emotional. Now he wondered if she'd been wrestling with the knowledge that she was about to trap him in a marriage built on lies. Harold stood up, still holding the classified file, and walked to the window. Outside, the world looked exactly the same as it had this morning. But everything had changed, everything. He thought about their wedding day. She'd told him she had no family to invite, that she was alone in the world. He'd felt so lucky that she was choosing him, choosing his family. Now he understood she'd had no choice. She couldn't invite family that officially didn't exist. He thought about how she never wanted to travel overseas, always making excuses when he suggested trips to Europe. How she'd learned multiple languages but rarely spoke them. How she sometimes woke from nightmares she wouldn't discuss. How she always seemed slightly alert, like she was listening for something. All those little quirks he'd found endearing or mysterious. They were all symptoms of a secret life he'd known nothing about. Harold looked at the passport again, at the name Margaret Kovac. Who was she, really? The woman he'd loved for 60 years was built on a foundation he'd never seen, never suspected. Everything he thought he knew about her early life was fiction. Had anything she told him been true? He sank onto the bed, surrounded by the evidence of his wife's hidden past. And for the first time since he was a young man, Harold cried. Not gentle tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere dark inside him. He'd built his entire adult life with this woman. They'd created a family together. And he didn't even know her real name until today. His phone rang, making him jump. It was Patricia. "Dad? Mom's awake. She's asking for you." Harold looked at the documents spread across the bed, at the life he'd thought he knew lying in pieces around him. He wiped his eyes and tried to steady his voice. "I'm on my way." He carefully gathered everything back into the drawer, not trying to organize it, just wanting it out of sight. He locked the drawer and put the key in his pocket. Then he picked up the overnight bag with Margaret's things and headed for the door. In the car, driving back to the hospital, Harold's mind raced. Should he confront her? Demand answers? Or should he pretend he'd never opened that drawer? Never discovered her secrets? And the biggest question of all, the one that terrified him most. If she'd lied about who she was, had she lied about loving him too? Had their entire marriage been part of some cover story? Some mission she'd been assigned? By the time Harold pulled into the hospital parking lot, he'd made a decision. He would confront her, he had to. 60 years of marriage deserved the truth, whatever that truth might be. Even if it destroyed everything, he needed to know who the woman he loved really was. He walked through the hospital corridors with the key to her secret life heavy in his pocket, heading toward answers he wasn't sure he was ready to hear. Harold stood outside Margaret's hospital room for a full minute before he could make himself go in. Through the small window in the door, he could see her propped up in bed, looking small and fragile against the white pillows. Patricia sat beside her, holding her hand and talking softly. His daughter looked up and saw him. She smiled and waved him in, but Harold saw the worry in her eyes. Margaret's face was still slightly drooped on the left side, and when she turned to look at him, the fear in her expression was unmistakable. She knew. Somehow she knew he'd found everything. "Dad, I'm going to grab some coffee," Patricia said, standing up. "I'll give you two some time alone." After she left, the room fell into heavy silence. Harold set the overnight bag on the chair and moved to Margaret's bedside. He wanted to take her hand like he always did, but he couldn't make himself do it. "Not yet." "Harold," Margaret said, her voice still slightly slurred from the stroke. "Please, sit down." He pulled the chair closer and sat, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The key to her nightstand drawer felt like it was burning a hole in his pocket. "How are you feeling?" he asked, because he didn't know how else to start. "Better. The doctors say I'll recover." She paused, studying his face. "But that's not what you want to talk about, is it?" Harold pulled the key from his pocket and held it up. Margaret's good hand flew to her mouth and tears immediately filled her eyes. "You opened it," she whispered. "I needed your insurance card." "I didn't mean to." He stopped. "No, that's not true. I did mean to. And I found everything, Margaret. Or should I say Margarete?" She flinched like he'd struck her. A tear rolled down her cheek and she couldn't wipe it away because her left arm still wasn't working properly. Harold's instinct was to do it for her, but he stayed in his chair. "How much did you read?" she asked quietly. "Enough. The passports. The classified file. The photos. Enough to know that everything you've told me about your life before we met was a lie." "Not everything," she said quickly. "Not the important things." "Which parts were true then?" "Because I'm sitting here trying to figure out if anything about our marriage was real." Margaret closed her eyes and more tears leaked out. "Can I tell you the whole story?" "Will you let me explain?" Harold wanted to say no, wanted to walk out and never come back. But 60 years of love, even love built on lies, wouldn't let him. He nodded stiffly. Margaret took a shaky breath and began to speak. Her words came slowly at first, partly from the stroke and partly from the weight of secrets she'd carried for so long. "My real name is Margareta Kovac. I was born in Budapest in 1943, right in the middle of the war. My father was a professor. My mother was a teacher. We were Jewish, but we survived because my father had connections, people who helped hide us." Harold's chest tightened. He'd never known Margaret was Jewish. They'd gone to Protestant church together for 60 years. After the war, things were hard. The Soviets took over. My father lost his position at the university because he was considered too Western in his thinking. We lived in constant fear. Then when I was 16, my parents were arrested. Her voice broke and she had to pause. Harold found himself leaning forward despite his anger. "They accused my father of being a spy for the West. It wasn't true, but truth didn't matter. They took both my parents one night. I never saw them again. I learned later that they died in prison within 6 months." "Margaret," Harold said softly, using the name he'd always known her by. "I was alone at 16, she continued, living in an apartment that wasn't mine anymore, with no money and no future. That's when they approached me. Men from Western intelligence. They knew my father had contacts, knew things. They said they could get me out of Hungary if I did something for them first." "You were just a child," Harold said, his anger momentarily forgotten in the face of such tragedy. "I was desperate, and I was angry, so angry at what had been done to my parents, to my country, to me, so I agreed. They trained me for a few months, taught me how to move information, how to blend in, how to disappear if I needed to. Then they sent me to work." Margaret's eyes took on a distant look, seeing things Harold could only imagine. "For 5 years I was a courier. I moved documents, photographs, messages between East and West Berlin. It was dangerous, but I was good at it. Maybe too good. They started trusting me with bigger jobs, more sensitive information." "What happened in 1962? Harold asked. The file said something went wrong. Margaret's face went pale. "I was supposed to pick up a package from a contact in East Berlin, but when I got there I found him dead, and I saw who did it. A high-ranking officer, someone who was supposed to be on our side. He was working for the Soviets, selling information that got people killed." She was shaking now, reliving the memory. "He saw me. I ran, but he knew who I was. Within hours there was a price on my head from both sides. The Soviets wanted me dead because I'd seen their spy. Our side wanted me dead because I knew about their failure, about how compromised their operations were. So they gave you a new identity," Harold said, beginning to understand it was the only way to keep me alive. "They brought me to America, created Margaret Anderson from nothing, gave me a fake history, fake documents, fake everything. I was 19 years old and I had to become someone else entirely or die." Harold sat back in his chair trying to process it all. "And then you met me?" "Yes." Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "They sent me to that small town in Connecticut, told me to live a quiet life and blend in. I went to that church social because I was lonely and scared and trying so hard to be normal. And then I saw you. Standing by the punch bowl looking uncomfortable, Harold said, remembering. A ghost of a smile crossed her face. You were so kind. So genuine. When you talked to me, you didn't see a spy or a refugee or someone with a tragic past. You just saw a girl in a blue dress. I hadn't felt that normal, that human in years. But you lied to me from the start. I had to. The words came out with unexpected force, and Margaret struggled to catch her breath. I wanted to tell you so many times, Harold. On our third date, when you said you were falling in love with me. On the night you proposed. The day we got married. Every single day after that. But they'd made me promise. No one could know, ever. If the truth came out, I'd be killed. Maybe you would be, too. Harold felt like he'd been punched. I was in danger? All these years? Probably not. After the first few years, after I'd checked in with my handler enough times and nothing happened, they left me alone. The world moved on. The Cold War ended. The people who wanted me dead got old or died themselves, but the secret remained. She reached out with her good hand, trying to touch him, but Harold pulled back. The hurt on her face was immediate and deep. I understand if you hate me, she said. I've lied to you for 60 years. About my name, my past, my family. The woman you married was a fiction. Was she? Harold's voice was harsh. Was Margaret Anderson completely fake? Or was some of her real? Margaret looked directly into his eyes. The moment I fell in love with you was real. The day we got married was real. Every child we had, every anniversary, every fight and every makeup, every morning I woke up beside you. All of it was real. Margaret Kovach was a scared girl who did terrible things to survive. Margaret Anderson was the woman who got to build a life with the man she loved. That woman was real, Harold. She's who I chose to be. But you never told me. In 60 years, you never trusted me with the truth. It wasn't about trust. She was crying openly now. I wanted to tell you so badly. But I was terrified. Not just of what might happen to me, but of losing you. What if you couldn't love me anymore once you knew? What if you looked at me differently? What if everything we'd built together came crashing down? Harold stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the world continued like nothing had changed. Cars in the parking lot. People walking to the entrance. Normal life carrying on while his own life lay in pieces. Our children, he said without turning around. They have no idea their mother isn't who she says she is. No, they only know Margaret Anderson. The mother who raised them, who loved them, who gave them everything she could. Built on a lie. Built on love. Margaret's voice cracked. Yes, I lied about my past. But I never lied about loving them. Or loving you. That was the only truth that ever mattered to me. Harold turned back to face her. Why now? Why did you have that box out on our anniversary? Were you planning to tell me? Margaret's face crumbled. I received a letter that morning. From someone I worked with 60 years ago. He's dying and he wanted to warn me. The government is declassifying files from that era. My real identity is going to become public record eventually. Maybe next year, maybe 5 years from now, but it's coming. So you would have kept lying if you'd had the choice. I don't know, she admitted. I've asked myself that question 1,000 times since that letter arrived. Part of me wanted to tell you everything, to finally be free of this burden, but part of me wanted to take it to my grave and spare you this pain. She reached out again, and this time Harold let her take his hand. Her grip was weak but desperate. I know I have no right to ask you for anything, she said, but I need you to understand something. When I became Margaret Anderson, I wasn't just putting on a disguise. I was trying to become a person who deserved to live. Margaret Kovach had seen too much death, had done things she couldn't live with. But Margaret Anderson got to be good, got to build something beautiful, got to love and be loved. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. You saved me, Harold. Not from the people who wanted me dead, from the person I was becoming. You gave me a reason to be Margaret Anderson instead of just pretending to be her. Harold sat down again, suddenly exhausted. I don't know what to do with this. I don't know how to process that my entire marriage is built on something that wasn't real. It was real, Margaret insisted. The foundation might have been false, but what we built on top of it was solid and true. Our love was real. Our family is real. The life we made together is real. But how can I trust anything now? How do I know what's true and what's another lie? Ask me anything. I'll tell you everything. No more secrets, Harold. I swear it. They sat in silence for a long moment. Harold's mind was spinning with questions, with hurt, with confusion. But one question pushed its way to the front. Did you ever love anyone before me? In your old life? Margaret's expression softened. No, there wasn't time for love. Just survival. You were my first love, Harold. My only love. That's the truth. And your parents. Do you think about them? Every day. I couldn't even tell our children about them. Patricia thinks she's named after my great-aunt. She's actually named after my mother, Patricia Kovacs. It was the only way I could keep my mother's memory alive. Harold felt something shift inside him. Despite everything, despite the lies and the deception, this was still Margaret. Still the woman who'd held his hand through his father's death, who'd stayed up all night with sick children, who'd built a life alongside him for 60 years. I need time, he said finally. I can't just pretend this doesn't change everything. Because it does. I know, Margaret said quietly. Take all the time you need. But please, Harold, please don't give up on us. Not after 60 years. Not after everything we've been through. Harold stood up, looking down at his wife in the hospital bed. She looked so small, so vulnerable. And despite everything, he still loved her. That was the part that hurt most. Even knowing she'd lied, even knowing their entire foundation was built on fiction, he couldn't stop loving her. I'm going to tell Patricia and Robert, he said. They deserve to know the truth about their mother. Margaret nodded, fresh tears streaming down her face. I understand. Whatever you need to do. Harold walked to the door, then paused. Without turning around, he said, For what it's worth, I'm glad you survived. I'm glad Margaret Anderson got to exist, even if she was created from lies. Because despite everything, I can't imagine my life without her. Then he walked out, leaving Margaret crying in her hospital bed, both of them wondering if 60 years of love could survive the weight of such profound deception. Harold found Patricia and Robert in the hospital cafeteria, sitting at a corner table with untouched coffee cups in front of them. They both looked up when he approached, and he could see the question in their eyes. How is she? What did the doctor say? When can she come home? But Harold had different news to share, and he had no idea how to begin. Dad? Patricia stood up, alarmed by whatever she saw in his face. Is Mom okay? Did something happen? She's stable. The doctors say she'll recover. Harold pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. But I need to talk to you both about something else. Something important. Robert exchanged a worried glance with his sister. You're scaring us. Harold looked at his hands, at the wedding ring he'd worn for 60 years. How did you tell your children that their mother wasn't who they thought she was? That their entire family history was built on lies? Your mother's name isn't Margaret Anderson, he said quietly. It's Margaret Kovacs. She was born in Hungary in 1943, and she spent the first part of her life doing things for the government that she couldn't talk about. When she met me, she was living under a false identity to protect herself from people who wanted her dead. The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Robert just stared at him like he'd started speaking a foreign language. Dad, Robert finally said, what are you talking about? Is this because of the stroke? Are you confused? I wish I was. Harold pulled the small key from his pocket and set it on the table. I found documents in her nightstand. Passports with different names. Files marked classified. Your mother was a spy during the Cold War. Margaret Anderson was created by the government to hide who she really was. Patricia sat down abruptly. That's impossible. Mom is just Mom. She's a retired librarian who makes excellent pot roast and volunteers at church. She's not some spy. I saw the proof. I confronted her about it just now. She told me everything. Harold's voice cracked. Everything she's told us about her life before we met was a lie. Her parents weren't killed in a car accident in Boston. They were arrested by the Soviets in Budapest and died in prison. She had a whole other life before she became Margaret Anderson. Robert shook his head slowly. This doesn't make sense. Why would she lie for so long? Because she had to. Because people wanted her dead. Because the government told her she could never tell anyone, not even her family. Harold looked at his children, seeing his own confusion and hurt reflected in their faces. She's been carrying this secret for 60 years, living with it every single day of our marriage. Patricia's eyes filled with tears. Did she ever plan to tell us? No. She would have taken it to her grave if she could have. Harold explained about the letter, about the files being declassified, about how Margaret's past was finally catching up with her. That's why she's been acting strange lately. She knew this was coming. So what does this mean? Robert asked. Is she in danger, are we? I don't think so. Not anymore. The Cold War ended decades ago. The people who wanted her dead are probably dead themselves now. But her real identity is going to become public eventually. And when it does, everyone will know that Margaret Anderson never existed. Patricia wiped her eyes. I need to see her. I need to hear this from her. She'll tell you everything, Harold said. She promised no more lies. They went upstairs together, a family about to confront a truth that changed everything they thought they knew about themselves. When they entered Margaret's room, she took one look at their faces and started crying. I'm so sorry, she said before anyone could speak. I'm so sorry. Patricia approached the bed slowly like she was approaching a stranger. Is it true? Everything Dad said? Margaret nodded, unable to speak. Who are you? Patricia asked, and the question hung in the air like an accusation. I'm your mother, Margaret said firmly, despite the tears streaming down her face. That's who I am. That's who I've always been. But that's not your name. That's not your history. You lied to us our entire lives. I know, and I would give anything to change that, but I can't. Margaret looked at each of them in turn. I can only tell you why I did it and hope that someday you can understand. Robert crossed his arms. So tell us. Make us understand how you could lie to your own children. Margaret took a shaky breath and began her story again. She told them about growing up in Budapest, about losing her parents, about becoming a courier to survive. She told them about the night in East Berlin when everything went wrong, about the fake identity and the new life in America. When I met your father, she said, looking at Harold, I fell in love for the first time in my life. And when we had you, Patricia, I held you in my arms and I thought, this is what I was supposed to survive for. This is why I made it through everything. So I could be your mother. She turned to Robert. And when you came along 2 years later, I felt the same way. You weren't born to a spy or a refugee. You were born to a mother who loved you more than anything in the world. That part was never a lie. But you named me after a grandmother I never knew. Patricia said bitterly, a grandmother you told me died before I was born. She did die before you were born. In a Soviet prison in 1959. Margaret's voice broke. I named you Patricia because it was the only way I could keep my mother's memory alive. It was the only piece of my real past I could give to you. What else did you lie about? Robert demanded. How much of our childhood was real? All of it, Margaret insisted. Every birthday party, every Christmas morning, every scraped knee I bandaged, and every nightmare I comforted you through. That was all real. I was really your mother. You were really my children. The love was always real. Patricia sat down in the chair beside the bed. I don't know who you are anymore. Yes, you do. You know exactly who I am. I'm the woman who taught you to read before you started school. I'm the one who stayed up all night when you had pneumonia when you were 7. I'm the one who held you while you cried over your first heartbreak. Margaret reached out and took her daughter's hand. I'm your mother. The name I was born with doesn't change that. Harold watched his children struggle with the same questions he'd been wrestling with for hours. Who was this woman they'd known their entire lives? Could they trust anything about her? Did blood and truth matter more than years of love and sacrifice? There's more, Margaret said quietly. Things I haven't told you yet. Harold felt his stomach drop. What else could there possibly be? Margaret looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. The letter I received on our anniversary. It wasn't just a warning about the files being declassified. The man who wrote it, Victor, he was my handler back in the day. He's dying now and he wanted me to know something. She paused, gathering her courage. The mission that went wrong in East Berlin, the one that got me sent here with a new identity, it wasn't just bad luck. Victor recently found out it was a setup. Someone in our own intelligence service wanted me out of the way because I knew too much about something else entirely. What do you mean? Harold asked. I mean that for 60 years I thought I was in hiding because I witnessed a betrayal. But Victor discovered the truth before he got sick. I was deliberately burned, my identity deliberately compromised so they could relocate me and make sure I never talked about something I'd seen months earlier. Robert leaned forward. What did you see? Margaret's hands were shaking. I was in Prague in early 1962, picking up documents from a contact. While I was waiting at the dead drop location, I saw a meeting between someone from our side and someone from theirs. They were exchanging a large case, and I saw money. Lots of it. I didn't understand what it meant at the time, but I reported it. She looked at Harold. A few weeks later, they sent me to East Berlin on what they said was a routine pickup. But it was a trap. They wanted me compromised so they could ship me somewhere far away, where I couldn't ask questions or connect dots. Victor only figured this out recently when some of his old colleagues started dying under suspicious circumstances. Harold felt cold. Are you saying you're still in danger? I don't know. Victor thought I should know the truth before he dies, but he's not sure if the people involved are still alive or still care. It was 60 years ago. The world has moved on. But some secrets, some betrayals, they have long shadows. Patricia stood up abruptly. This is insane. This sounds like something from a movie, not real life. Our mother can't be mixed up in government conspiracies and Cold War secrets. But she is, Robert said quietly. He was looking at Margaret with new eyes, seeing her differently. That's why she always seemed to know things she shouldn't. Why she was so good at reading people. Why she never wanted us traveling to certain countries or talking to certain people. Margaret nodded. I spent your whole childhood being vigilant, watching for anything unusual, making sure no one from my old life ever found us. Do you remember when we moved suddenly when you were 8, Patricia? Your father thought it was for his job, but I'd seen someone at the grocery store who looked too familiar. I convinced Harold we needed to relocate for better opportunities. Harold stared at her. The move to Connecticut. That was because of this? Yes, and a dozen other small decisions over the years. Every choice I made, every place we lived, every friend we made, I was always thinking about keeping you safe. Keeping this secret buried. So our entire lives have been shaped by your lies, Patricia said. Our entire lives have been shaped by me trying to protect you. Margaret corrected gently. I know you're angry. You have every right to be. But please understand that everything I did, every lie I told, it was to keep you safe and give you normal lives. Lives that weren't touched by the darkness I came from. Robert walked to the window, his back to everyone. What happens now? If these files get declassified and people find out who you really are? I don't know, Margaret admitted. Maybe nothing. Maybe the story comes out and people are briefly interested and then forget about it. Or maybe someone who still cares about those old secrets decides I'm a loose end that needs to be tied up. That's not funny, Patricia said. I'm not joking. Margaret looked at her family, at the 3 people she loved most in the world. Victor warned me to be careful, to watch for anything unusual, to maybe consider telling you the truth so you'd be prepared if something happened. Harold felt something harden inside him. For hours he'd been drowning in hurt and betrayal. But now, hearing that his wife might be in danger, something else took over. 60 years of love, of partnership, of facing life together. That didn't just disappear because of lies. Then we deal with it, he said firmly. Together. As a family. Margaret looked at him with such hope it broke his heart. Harold, I don't expect you to forgive me.